India is strategizing the move in order to lessen the impact. That is something we will come to in due course of the program, Professor Singh. But to begin with, your thoughts also on the reasons that the US President has cited, and one of the important aspects being that he thinks this will help restore the lost manufacturing glory in his country. How do you look at it, or do you think it's going to happen otherwise? It's going to lead to recession, it's going to lead to price rise, and what are the implications that you see largely on America's economy and as a fallout on the global economy as well?
Thank you, Tina, for having me on your program. The easiest way to see what is happening is to look at how the stock market is responding to these tariff hikes. Second, I think it's a fundamentally global unleashing of disruption, and there is already likelihood of inflation definitely, but even global recession, which is being spoken of, which means the impacts are going to be really global in nature. And we are talking of about United States, 86 or so partner nations are getting directly impacted in various ways in that sense. But at core of it fundamentally is a problem between two gigantic economies, which collectively, United States and China, constitute over 40% of the global GDP of 200 nations. And here the problem is that you just mentioned that the manufacturing of United States has over years lost ground to the Chinese. And China today accounts for between 30 to 35% of global manufacturing. Again, one country of 200 countries is manufacturing 30-35% of the global manufacturing sector. And as a result, for about 2 decades, China has also emerged as world's largest trading nation. So the fundamental problem here is that China today has trillion-plus deficit in its global trade in its favor. Reverse is true of United States, which has trillion-plus trade deficit against it. So it is not just the loss of competitiveness in manufacturing sector. Of course, as Ambassador said, they are still much better in services, but it's fundamentally a feeling of losing ground to Chinese in terms of global leadership, global engagement. And that is where this concern of trade deficit of President Donald Trump is something that has been, brought forward to say we need to act, we need to rectify situation. And it's a crisis management, crisis kind of approach in a hurry to raise tariffs as high as 100% against the Chinese, which I think is going to be adding only to disruption between the various countries. India so far has been of the major economies on slightly advantage. Donald Trump says we from India impose of about 52% tariffs on American exports, but the tariffs imposed on India are about 26%. So India also is among the major economies, and therefore when there is a major disruption in relations among major economies, and European Union again, for example, is responding in a very interesting fashion, rather in a mute and imperceptive style of categorizing exports that come from United States to Europe from what they called red states, which are states that had voted for Donald Trump, to pick up those commodities, and second, impose the European tariffs on American exports to Europe in a staggered manner. Some of them beginning on 15th of this month, others had beginning in 16th of next month, and the final tranche will begin in 1st of December this year. So each group of countries, each country, China is confronting, India is conversing, India is trying to sign a trade agreement. So different countries are kind of gearing up to the situation differently. But fundamental question for all the countries today is how to become less dependent on the United States. And without speaking about it, I think most countries are beginning to think on that line.
Certainly. So the opportunity, the leadership has already taken a proactive approach. So let's hope that when the negotiations take place, we're able to crack a deal which is in favor of us. And remember, the US president has already termed India as a tough negotiator. So let's hope it works in our favor. But Professor Singh, when Dr. S. Jaishankar was asked about the impact on India, what India's strategy is going to be to lessen the impact of the tariffs imposed, his response was towards the negotiations that India is working with the US on the bilateral trade agreement, and which he said should conclude by fall. Help us and our viewers understand how the BTA is going to take care of the trade imbalance, and will this sort the issue or the sticking points which are related to the tariffs between India and the US?
The US Deputy Trade Representative-led team of 4 members was recently in New Delhi, and they have already started formal negotiations on how to move forward on BTA, a bilateral trade agreement. But let me add that the proactive approach of India began, I think, much earlier, before the world was waking up to what is going to happen. So starting from India's budget for this year, India had already kind of shown symbolic gestures as to where India is trying to rectify and do course correction in ensuring that the United States understands India already is responding to things that President Donald Trump was trying to make sure countries do in terms of making bilateral economic relations and trade relations much more balanced. And of course, Prime Minister's visit in February brought this issue much forward and formally announced that the 2 nations, I think India is an exception here, the first country to formally say that we are going to have a bilateral trade agreement. And even the timeline given by the fall of this year, second half of this year, somewhere we are going to sign a bilateral trade agreement. So I think proactive approach, as Ambassador mentioned, is very much in line with ensuring that it does not become necessarily, in favor of India or in favor of United States, but, ends up being a win-win situation. And so far, indications from United States are that they appreciate India's proactive approach. And that's why I said, when President Trump talks about India imposing 52% of tariffs, United States has imposed about half of it, 26% of tariffs on India. Second thing, I think, which we need to also underline here in terms of India's leverages. India, you notice, have had a trade deficit with the United States, which has been increasing in last several years. I think roughly from about $17 billion in 2021 to about $35 billion last year. Okay. So, that is indeed a matter of concern for United States, and President Trump is very much obsessed with this deficit being a problem. But here, India also is not just rectifying bilateral trade relations here to make sure that we are able to have much more productive relationship. India also has enormous leverages in sort of, for example, signing contracts for defense equipment imports. And that conversation is already taking place, whether it is F-35 or a whole lot of other drones and so on. That whole sector where India is world's largest importer for defense equipment and United States is world's largest exporter for defense equipment will create enormous avenues to blend together and ensure that there are new avenues of building partnerships, and that becomes part and parcel of India's Make in India as well. You see the conversation on small modular reactors for nuclear power generation, that United States is showing interest to do it in India market here and do the production here. And India is wanting not just production, but innovation, research and development as well. So there are enormous leverages we should also underline among major economies that India has. So India is neither seen as a close ally nor seen as an adversary like China, but somewhere in the middle where it creates that maneuvering space for India to ensure the damage limitation and ensure that the relationship continue to be productive for both sides.
Right. Since you spoke about this challenge, this situation brings India at the crossroads of economic opportunity, and perhaps this could be our chance to improve our financial relationship with countries in the East, address the trade deficit with countries, particularly in the East, and also emerge stronger in the global value chain. That is something that we've been trying to work towards. But this resurgence in trade tensions could be India's chance?
That is true, Tina. I remember 2 important, significant examples here. When United States had denied India the access to supercomputer, or when India had ensured that Russia does not supply cryogenic engines for India's rockets, both catapulted India into advancing its own alternatives. So sometime when you're pushed to the wall by circumstances like Trump is pushing several countries, not so much India as of now, countries may respond by doing things that will catapult them out of that difficult situation and make them really much more capable in coming times. Second, I think to me, that kind of strategy that President Trump is adopting in terms of giving ultimatums of 24 hours, setting the dates singularly, undermining the whole process, structures, norms of international trading that have existed for a century. To me, that's not very sustainable in my own assessment. We are already seeing a large amount of protests in various cities in the United States. We are reading about the name calling between the top advisor of Trump, Elon Musk, and his top trade advisor, Peter Navarro. We are hearing several of the billionaire supporters of President Trump, like Ken Langon or Ken Griffin and others, are openly becoming critical of tariffs as a strategy. And we saw during his first term also there was trade, technology, tariff wars that existed between the United States and China. So yes, it has created enormous disruption, and several countries and several groups of countries are adopting different methodologies, whether it is going for zero tariffs or it is confronting with slapping similar tariffs, or like India trying to have a conversation and strike a deal in terms of bilateral trade agreement. Whether that strategy is going to be effective, whether that strategy is going to be sustainable, I think we are seeing increasingly questions being placed on that itself. And if you notice that the media is talking about last several weeks having resulted in $6 to $7 trillion of damage to the stock markets, that is going to be also shrinking the kind of heft, economic heft that United States has had. And so therefore, I think whether sustainability of this kind of approach, this strategy, is itself something one has to look at carefully, should also help countries to sort of withstand pressures up to a certain amount of time. Several leaders in the United States are today talking that given this chaos, the disruption, the midterm elections will ensure that the Democrats come back to majority in both houses of US Congress, and could create grounds of change of presidency next time we have presidential elections. That is, of course, in the long run.
Right.
But that kind of insinuation, projections are also something that one has to take into account in building either the assessment of what this disruption is going to lead to, or building strategies as to how each country, given its own leverages and equations with President Trump, is going to resolve it. I think advantage India, again, is that India's leadership has managed so far the personal relationship with the American leadership, whether it is at the level of Secretary of State and Foreign Minister, National Security Advisors, or it is the national leaders, itself is something which should be seen as India's advantage. And second, of course, given the Quad meeting, the summit meeting, which is supposed to happen this year in India, India will have opportunity to actually host President Trump in India. And that also provides enormous maneuvering capacity to India to engage with the leadership of United States and ensure a certain amount of damage limitation and sort of resolving various irritants that exist in bilateral relations. So to me, it looks like when you look at the bigger picture of how the world is dealing with this unleashing of tariff blitzkrieg of President Trump, I think India is relatively in a vantage point and is really proactive in ensuring that those vantage points are utilized to ensure minimum damage in that sense that may occur. Reserve Bank of India, for example, is already talking of GDP growth coming down from 6.7% to 6.5%. But that's a minor adjustment, that is a projection which is being made, which shows that the damage to India is perhaps maybe there's going to be some cost of this disruption, but that perhaps is going to be minimalist, particularly given the proactive approach that Indian leadership has taken on the subject.
Right. And especially